Truth and Method. Chapter 1, Part 1. Section 3. Sensus Communis, Common Sense, or Shared Understanding. In this regard, it is important to remember the humanistic tradition and to ask what is to be learned from it with respect to the human science's mode of knowledge. Vico's De Nostri Temporis Studiorum Ratione makes a good starting point. As its very title shows, Vico's defense of humanism derives from the Jesuit pedagogical system and is directed as much against Jansenism as against Descartes. Like his outline of a new science, Vico's pedagogical manifesto is based on old truths. He appeals to the sensus communis, common sense, and to the humanistic ideal of eloquentia, elements already present in the classical concept of wisdom. Talking well has always had two meanings. It is not merely a rhetorical ideal. It also means saying the right thing, i.e. the truth, and is not just the art of speaking, of saying something well. This ideal was proclaimed in the ancient world just as much by teachers of philosophy as by those of rhetoric. Rhetoric was always in conflict with philosophy and, in contrast to the idle speculations of the sophists, claimed to teach true wisdom. Here Vico, himself a teacher of rhetoric, is in a humanistic tradition that stems from antiquity. This tradition is obviously important for the self-understanding of the human sciences. Especially so is the positive ambiguity of the rhetorical ideal, which is condemned not only by Plato, but by the anti-rhetorical methodology of modern times. In Vico, we already find much of what will concern us. But apart from the rhetorical element, his appeal to the sensus communis contains another element from classical tradition. This is the contrast between the scholar and the wise man on whom the scholar depends, a contrast that is drawn for the first time in the Cynic's conception of Socrates, and its content is based on the distinction between the ideas of Sophia and phronesis. It was first elaborated by Aristotle, developed by the Peripatetics as a critique of the theoretical ideal of life, and in the Hellenistic period helped define the image of the wise man, especially after the Greek ideal of Bildung, or cultivation, had been fused with the self-consciousness of the leading political class of Rome. Late Roman legal science also developed against the background of an art and practice of law that is closer to the practical ideal of phronesis than to the theoretical ideal of Sophia. With the renaissance of classical philosophy and rhetoric, the image of Socrates became the countercry against science, as is shown in particular in the figure of the idiota, the layman, who assumes a totally new role between the scholar and the wise man. Likewise, the rhetorical tradition of humanism invoked Socrates and the skeptical critique of the dogmatists. We find that Vico criticizes the Stoics because they believe in reason as the regula veri, and contrariwise, praises the old academicians, who assert only the knowledge of not knowing anything, and the new ones, because they excel in the art of arguing, which is part of rhetoric. Vico's appeal to the sensus communis undoubtedly exhibits a special coloring within this humanistic tradition. In this sphere of knowledge, too, there is a querelle des anciens et des modernes. It is no longer the contrast with the school, but the particular contrast with modern science that Vico has in mind. He does not deny the merits of modern critical science, but shows its limits. Even with this new science and its mathematical methodology, we still cannot do without the wisdom of the ancients and their cultivation of prudentia and eloquentia. But the most important thing in education is still something else, the training in the sensus communis, which is not nourished on the true but on the probable, the verisimilar. The main thing for our purposes is that here, sensus communis obviously does not mean only that general faculty in all men, but the sense that founds community. According to Vico, what gives the human will its direction is not the abstract universality of reason, but the concrete universality represented by the community of a group, a people, a nation, or the whole human race. Hence, developing this communal sense is of decisive importance for living. On this communal sense for what is true and right, which is not a knowledge based on argumentation, but enables one to discover what is evident, verisimile, Vico bases the significance and the independent rights of rhetoric. Education cannot, he says, tread the path of critical research. Youth demand images for its imagination and for forming its memory. But studying the sciences in the spirit of modern criticism does not achieve this. Thus, Vico supplements the Critica of Cartesianism with the Old Topica. This is the art of finding arguments and serves to develop the sense of what is convincing, which works instinctively and extempore, and for that very reason cannot be replaced by science. Vico's prescriptions have an apologetical air. They indirectly take cognizance of science's new concept of truth by the very fact that they defend the rights of the probable. As we have seen, he here follows an ancient rhetorical tradition that goes back to Plato. But what Vico means goes far beyond the defense of rhetorical persuasion. The old Aristotelian distinction between practical and theoretical knowledge is operative here, a distinction which cannot be reduced to that between the true and the probable. Practical knowledge, phronesis, is another kind of knowledge. Primarily, this means that it is directed towards the concrete situation. Thus, it must grasp the circumstances in their infinite variety. This is what Vico expressly emphasizes about it. It is true that his main concern is to show that this kind of knowledge lies outside the rational concept of knowledge, but this is not in fact mere resignation. The Aristotelian distinction refers to something other than the distinction between knowing on the basis of universal principles and on the basis of the concrete. Nor does he mean only the capacity to subsume the individual case under a universal category, what we call judgment. Rather, there is a positive ethical motif involved that merges into the Roman Stoic doctrine of the Sensus Communis. The grasp and moral control of the concrete situation requires subsuming what is given under the universal, that is, the goal that one is pursuing so that the right thing may result. Hence it presupposes a direction of the will, i.e., moral being. That is why Aristotle considers phronesis an intellectual virtue. He sees it not only as a capacity, but as a determination of moral being which cannot exist without the totality of the ethical virtues, which in turn cannot exist without it. Although practicing this virtue means that one distinguishes what should be done from what should not, it is not simply practical shrewdness and general cleverness. The distinction between what should and should not be done includes the distinction between the proper and the improper, and thus presupposes a moral attitude, which it continues to develop. This idea propounded by Aristotle against Plato's idea of the good is in fact what Vico's point about the sensus communis goes back to. In scholasticism, say for St. Thomas, in elaborating on the de anima, the sensus communis is the common root of the outer senses, i.e., the faculty that combines them, that makes judgments about what is given, a capacity that is given to all men. For Vico, however, the sensus communis is the sense of what is right and of the common good that is to be found in all men. Moreover, it is a sense that is acquired through living in the community and is determined by its structures and aims. This concept sounds like natural law, like the koinai enoiai of the Stoics. But the sensus communis is not, in this sense, a Greek concept, and definitely does not mean the koin dunamis of which Aristotle speaks in the De Anima, when he tries to reconcile the doctrine of the specific senses with the phenomenological finding that all perception is a differentiation and an intention of the universal. Rather, Vico goes back to the old Roman concept of the sensus communis, as found especially in the Roman classics which, when faced with Greek cultivation, held firmly to the value and significance of their own traditions of civil and social life. A critical note directed against the theoretical speculations of the philosophers can be heard in the Roman concept of the sensus communis. And that note Vico sounds again from his different position of opposition to modern science. There is something immediately evident about grounding philological and historical studies and the ways the human sciences work on this concept of the sensus communis. For their object, the moral and historical existence of humanity, as it takes shape in our words and deeds, is itself decisively determined by the sensus communis. Thus, A conclusion based on universals, a reasoned proof, is not sufficient, because what is decisive is the circumstances. But this is only a negative formulation. The sense of the community mediates its own positive knowledge. One does not at all exhaust the mode of historical knowledge by saying that here one has to allow belief in other people's testimony instead of self-conscious deduction. Nor is it at all true that such knowledge has less truth value. D'Alembert is correct when he writes, "Probability operates principally in the case of historical facts, and in general for all past, present, and future events, which we attribute to a kind of chance because we do not unravel the causes. The part of this knowledge whose object is the present and the past, although it may be founded on testimony alone, often produces in us a conviction as strong as that born from axioms." Historia is a source of truth, totally different from theoretical reason. This is what Cicero meant when he called it the vita memoriae. It exists in its own right, because human passions cannot be governed by the universal prescriptions of reason. In this sphere one needs, rather, convincing examples as only history can offer them. That is why Bacon describes Historia, which supplies these examples, as virtually another way of philosophizing. This too is negative enough in its formulation. But we will see that in all these versions, the mode of being of moral knowledge, as recognized by Aristotle, is operative. It will be important to recall this so that the human sciences can understand themselves more adequately. Vico's return to the Roman concept of the sensus communis and his defense of humanist rhetoric against modern science is of special interest to us, for here we are introduced to an element of truth in the human sciences that was no longer recognizable when they conceptualized themselves in the 19th century. Vico lived in an unbroken tradition of rhetorical and humanist culture, and had only to reassert anew its ageless claim. Ultimately, it has always been known that the possibilities of rational proof and instruction do not fully exhaust the sphere of knowledge. Hence, Vico's appeal to the sensus communis belongs, as we have seen, in a wider context that goes right back to antiquity, and whose continued effect into the present day is our theme. We, on the contrary, must laboriously make our way back into this tradition by first showing the difficulties that result from the application of the modern concept of method to the human sciences. Let us therefore consider how this tradition became so impoverished, and how the human sciences' claim to know something true came to be measured by a standard foreign to it, namely, the methodical thinking of modern science. In general, Vico and the unbroken rhetorical tradition of Italy do not directly influence this development, which was determined chiefly by the German historical school. One can discern hardly any influence of Vico on the 18th century. But he was not alone in his appeal to the sensus communis. He has an important parallel in Shaftesbury, who had a powerful influence on the 18th century. Shaftesbury places the evaluation of the social significance of wit and humor under sensus communis, and explicitly cites the Roman classics and their humanist interpreters. As we have noted, the concept of the sensus communis undoubtedly reminds us of the Stoics and of the natural law. Nevertheless, it is impossible to deny the validity of the humanistic interpretation based on the Roman classics, which Shaftesbury follows. By sensus communis, according to Shaftesbury, the humanists understood a sense of the common weal, but also love of the community or society, natural affection, humanity, obligingness. They adopt a term from Marcus Aurelius, koinonoimosun, a most unusual and artificial word, confirming that the concept of sensus communis does not originate with the Greek philosophers, but has the Stoical conception sounding in it like a harmonic. The humanist Salmasius describes the content of this word as a restrained, customary, and regular way of thinking in a man, which as it were looks to the community and does not refer everything to its own advantage, but directs its attention to those things with which it is concerned, and thinks of itself with restraint and proper measure. What Shaftesbury is thinking of is not so much a capacity given to all men, part of the natural law, as a social virtue, a virtue of the heart more than of the head. And if he understands wit and humor in terms of it, then in this respect too he is following ancient Roman concepts that include in humanitas a refined savoir-vivre, the attitude of the man who understands a joke and tells one because he is aware of a deeper union with his interlocutor. Shaftesbury explicitly limits wit and humor to social intercourse among friends. Though the Sensus Communis appears here mostly as a virtue of social intercourse, there is nevertheless a moral, even a metaphysical basis implied. Shaftesbury is thinking of the intellectual and social virtue of sympathy, and on it, we recall, he based not only morality, but an entire aesthetic metaphysics. His successors, above all Hutcheson and Hume, elaborated his suggestions into the doctrine of the moral sense, which was later to serve as a foil to Kantian ethics. The concept of common sense acquired a quite central systematic function in Scottish philosophy, which was directed polemically against metaphysics and against its dissolution in skepticism, and built up its new system on the basis of original and natural judgments of common sense. Doubtless, this was influenced by the Aristotelian and scholastic tradition of the concept of sensus communis. Inquiry into the senses and their cognitive capacity comes from this tradition and is ultimately intended to correct the exaggerations of philosophical speculation. At the same time, however, the connection between common sense and society is preserved. They serve to direct us in the common affairs of life, where our reasoning faculty would leave us in the dark. In their eyes, the philosophy of sound understanding, of good sense, is not only a cure for the moon sickness of metaphysics, but also contains the basis of a moral philosophy that really does justice to the life of society. The moral element in the concept of common sense, or le bon sens, has remained to the present day and distinguishes these from the German concept of der gesunde Menschenverstand, sound understanding. Take as an example Henri Bergson's fine speech on le bon sens given at the award ceremony in 1895 at the Sorbonne. His criticism of the abstractions of natural science, of language, and of legal thinking, his passionate appeal to the inner energy of an intelligence which at each moment wins itself back to itself, eliminating ideas already formed to give place to those in the process of being formed, was called le bon sens in France. Naturally, the definition of this concept certainly contained a reference to the senses, but for Bergson it obviously goes without saying that, unlike the senses, le bon sens refers to the milieu social. While the other senses relate us to things, good sense governs our relations with persons. It is a kind of genius for practical life, but less a gift than the constant task of renewed adaptation to new situations, a work of adapting general principles to reality, through which justice is realized, a tactfulness in practical truth, a rightness of judgment that stems from correctness of soul. Le bon sens, for Bergson, is, as the common source of thought and will, a sense social, which avoids both the mistakes of the scientific dogmatists who are looking for social laws and those of the metaphysical utopians. Perhaps there is, properly speaking, no method, but rather a certain way of acting. It is true that he speaks of the importance of classical studies for the development of this bon sens. He sees them as an attempt to break through the ice of words and discover the free flow of thought below. But he does not ask the contrary question, namely how necessary le bon sens is for classical studies, i.e., he does not speak of its hermeneutic function. His question has nothing to do with the sciences, but with the independent significance of le bon sens for life. We are emphasizing only the self-evidence with which the moral and political meaning of this concept dominated his mind and that of his hearers. It is very characteristic of the human sciences' self-reflection in the 19th century that they proceeded not under the influence of the tradition of moral philosophy, to which both Vico and Shaftesbury belong, and which is represented primarily by France, the classical land of le bon sens, but under the influence of the German philosophy of the age of Kant and Goethe. Whereas even today in England and the Romance countries, the concept of the sensus communis is not just a critical slogan, but a general civic quality. In Germany, the followers of Shaftesbury and Hutcheson did not, even in the 18th century, take over the political and social element contained in Sensus Communis. The metaphysics of the schools and the popular philosophy of the 18th century, however much they studied and imitated the leading countries of the Enlightenment, England and France, could not assimilate an idea for which the social and political conditions were utterly lacking. The concept of Sensus Communis was taken over, but in being emptied of all political content, it lost its genuine critical significance. Sensus Communis was understood as a purely theoretical faculty, theoretical judgment, parallel to moral consciousness, conscience, and taste. Thus, it was integrated into a scholasticism of the basic faculties, of which Herder provided the critique in the fourth Kritischen Weltchen directed against Riedel, and which made him the forerunner of historicism in the field of aesthetics also. And yet there is one important exception: pietism. It was important not only for a man of the world like Shaftesbury to delimit the claims of science, i.e. of demonstratio, against the school, and to appeal to the Sensus Communis, but also for the preacher who seeks to reach the hearts of his congregation. Thus, the Swabian pietist Oetinger explicitly relied on Shaftesbury's defense of the Sensus Communis. We find Sensus Communis translated simply as heart, and the following description: the Sensus Communis is concerned only with things that all men see daily before them, things that hold an entire society together, things that are concerned as much with truths and statements as with the arrangements and patterns comprised in statements. Oetinger is concerned to show that it is not just a question of the clarity of the concepts. Clarity is not enough for living knowledge. Rather, there must be certain anticipations and predilections present. Fathers are moved without proof to care for their children. Love does not demonstrate, but often against reason rends the heart at the beloved's reproach. Oetinger's appeal to the Sensus Communis against the rationalism of the school is especially interesting for us because he gives it an expressly hermeneutical application. For Oetinger, as a churchman, the important thing is the understanding of Scripture. Because the mathematical, demonstrative method fails here, he demands another, the generative method, i.e., the organic presentation of Scripture, so that justice may be planted like a shoot. Oetinger also made the concept of Sensus Communis the object of an extended and learned investigation, which is likewise directed against rationalism. He sees in it the source of all truths, the very ars inveniendi, in contrast to Leibniz, who bases everything on a mere calculus metaphysicus, excluso omni gusto interno. According to Oetinger, the true basis of the Sensus Communis is the concept of vita, life, Sensus Communis vitae gaudens. In contrast to the violent anatomization of nature through experiment and calculation, he sees the natural development of the simple into the complex as the universal law of growth of the divine creation and likewise of the human spirit. For the idea that all knowledge originates in the Sensus Communis, he quotes Wolff, Bernoulli, and Pascal, Maupertuis's investigation into the origin of language, Bacon, Fenelon, etc., and defines the Sensus Communis as the vivid and penetrating perception of objects evident to all human beings, from their immediate contact and intuition, which are absolutely simple. From this second sentence, it is apparent that Oetinger throughout combines the humanistic political meaning of the word with the peripatetic concept of Sensus Communis. The above definition reminds one here and there, immediate contact and intuition, of Aristotle's doctrine of nous. He takes up the Aristotelian question of the common dunamis, which combines seeing, hearing, etc., and for him, it confirms the genuinely divine mystery of life. The divine mystery of life is its simplicity. Even if man has lost it through the fall, he can still find his way back, through the grace of God, to unity and simplicity. The activity of the Logos, that is, the presence of God, integrates diversity into unity. The presence of God consists precisely in life itself, in this communal sense that distinguishes all living things from dead. It is no accident that he mentions the polyp and the starfish, which, though cut into small pieces, regenerate themselves and form new individuals. In man, the same divine power operates in the form of the instinct and inner stimulation, to discover the traces of God, and to recognize what has the greatest connection with human happiness and life. Oettinger expressly distinguishes rational truths from receptivity to common truths, sensible truths, useful to all men at all times and places. The communal sense is a complex of instincts, i.e., a natural drive towards that on which the true happiness of life depends, and to that extent, an effect of the presence of God. Instincts are not to be understood, with Leibniz, as effects, i.e., as confusi representationis, for they are not ephemeral but deeply rooted tendencies, and have a dictatorial, divine, irresistible force. Based on these instincts, Sensus Communis is of special importance for our knowledge, precisely because they are a gift of God. Oettinger writes, "The ratio governs itself by rules, often even without God, but sense, always with God. Just as nature is different from art, so sense and ratio are different. God works through nature in a simultaneous increase in growth that spreads regularly throughout the whole. Art, however, begins with some particular part. Sense imitates nature. The ratio, art." Interestingly enough, this statement comes from a hermeneutical context, as indeed in this learned work the Sapientia Salomonis represents the ultimate object and highest example of knowledge. It comes from the chapter on the usus of the Sensus Communis. Here Oettinger attacks the hermeneutical theory of the Wolffian school. More important than all hermeneutical rules is to be sensu plenus. Naturally, this thesis is a spiritualistic extreme, but it still has its logical foundation in the concept of vita, or sensus communis. Its hermeneutical meaning can be illustrated by this sentence: "The ideas found in Scripture and in the works of God are the more fruitful and purified, the more that each can be seen in the whole, and all can be seen in each." Here, what people in the 19th and 20th centuries like to call intuition is brought back to its metaphysical foundation. That is, to the structure of living, organic being in which the whole is in each individual. The whole of life has its center in the heart, which by means of common sense grasps countless things all at the same time. More profound than all knowledge of hermeneutical rules is the application to oneself. Above all, apply the rules to yourself, and then you will have the key to understanding Solomon's Proverbs. On this basis, Oettinger is able to bring his ideas into harmony with those of Shaftesbury, who, as he says, is the only one to have written about Sensus Communis under this title. But he also cites others who have noted the one-sidedness of the rational method, e.g., Pascal's distinction between esprit géométrique and esprit de finesse. Nevertheless, for the Swabian pietist, what crystallizes around the concept of sensus communis is rather a theological than a political or social interest. Of course, other pietist theologians have emphasized application against the dominant rationalism in the same way as Oettinger, as we can see from the example of Rambach, whose very influential hermeneutics also dealt with application. But when pietistic tendencies were supplanted in the later 18th century, the hermeneutic function of sensus communis declined to a mere corrective. That which contradicts the consensus of feelings, judgments, and conclusions, i.e., the sensus communis, cannot be correct. In contrast to the importance that Shaftesbury assigned to the sensus communis for society and state, this negative function shows that the concept was emptied and intellectualized by the German Enlightenment.